Hi, I'm over here dancing the music. Forgot to put my microphone in front of me. I put it off to the side when I edit. Hello, welcome to Storytime. I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. I also realize a lot of other people do too, like pastors and priests and rabbis and apologists. We all care very much. So what I'm here to do today is to have a little bit more of an engagement with a particular apologist. So I'm a member of a group called the Diablocritics, and a week and a half ago, we responded to a particular video by a man with a PhD who was formerly a pastor, Gavin Ortlund. What he did in responding to and talking about the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 21. We responded to it, and I have such a very different way of coming at responding to these videos than my fellow panelists do. And I try very much to just kind of play that game because they're all Hebrew Bible scholars or ancient Near East and ancient things, more aligned with Hebrew Bible stuff. And I want to have more ideological conversations with things, in particular in this kind of a situation. So I want to start out before going through parts of his video and offering a couple things that there just wasn't time to say in that panel. I want to say a few words about where I'm coming from. Someone asked me, what are my biases? And I would think that if you've watched any of my content or read any of my publications, that you would have a decent idea of where I'm coming from. But I also understand that it's really helpful to have someone just say it, right? So let me stop fidgeting here. Okay, so let me tell you just a few pieces about who I am that inform my biases, okay? First of all, obviously, I am a biblical scholar, right? I do have a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. My undergraduate degree was in mathematics for teaching high school, started as an engineer. So I like languages, math, analytical stuff. I like analyzing. My PhD is in New Testament and early Christianity from Vanderbilt. So I put in 9 years of graduate work, right, in total, on this issue of the Bible and, as it turns out, culture and literary engagements with it. So I did a cultural studies kind of semi-focus in my biblical, in my PhD work. So I had 6 years of PhD work. This is important to me. But what I think some of you know, but maybe not everybody knows, is that I was an evangelist in my 20s. And I was involved with an organization called Young Life, and I was a volunteer all through college, and I was bringing people to Christ. Like, I believed in what Gavin believes, right? Full on, I was a volunteer in college. I was 2 years full-time ministry, still within Young Life. And so, I was an apologist of sorts. I was an evangelist. I knew how to handle some of the difficult passages. I knew how to kind of find a way to be okay with the general content, or I just honestly hadn't read it all, or I just kind of had this general sense of God can do what God needs to do, and it's up to us to, uphold God's law or whatever, uphold the word of God, all those things, right? So, that the stance that Gavin Ortlund and others like him take, I understand it. And the thing that's, I've actually struggled over the last week trying to kind of sift out what the specifics are that I would want to say that helps you understand how I'm different or what's different for me. And I think the best way for me to name what's going on here for me now. I used to try to find ways to make the Bible okay and to find ways to accommodate myself to it. And that comes from, in particular, at least the communities I was in, that comes from, that idea that all scripture is God breathed in 2 Timothy 3:16, useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, right? And so the word of God is a double-edged sword, all that stuff. So needing to put the Bible above all else was something I lived to a fault for a very long time. much to my family's chagrin, actually. And so what changed for me? What changed for me was I had to start acknowledging people's lives. So I had been able to just not have to deal with it or not acknowledge it. I remember I was in high school. I had several coworkers. I worked in for the theater in the box office. I worked in a box office for the summer, and like several of my colleagues were gay men. And, like I knew what I thought about that, how I thought that was wrong about them. That part of who they were was wrong and all this stuff. But like, I wasn't interested in talking to them about it. So I just listened and I just got to know them as people. And it was, enlightening to just listen to people talk about themselves. There are just so many pieces to the picture, right? I had to stop pretending that it didn't matter, right? That what I believed the Bible said about something, I had to stop pretending. I had to be really honest about it, right? That when it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority, I believed that. And I said to my mother on her day of ordination, how could you do this? It's against God's will for women to be ordained, even though I'd had women pastors growing up, right? So the power, this is why I care so much about the rhetorics of scripture and the power of language and the authority that communities give to a text, a collection of texts, the authority they give to their leaders. I care about that because I used to be that, and I can see how that worked for me. In spite of these really beautiful people having sex with people the same sex, I still judged them as a sinner because of who they were. Even though I thought they were lovely people. I can see how that worked for me, right? I can see how I moved into a space of putting these particular words above the real life lived realities of people around me I cared about. Right? That's why, it's scary to befriend someone who doesn't believe the same way if you're an evangelist or whatever, because they might rub off on you. And that is absolutely true. Their view on the world and not believing in hell might actually rub off on you. So this isn't what I had written out, by the way. I'm totally going rogue. I had some things written out and I was going to be very calm and quiet. Apparently, I decided not to do that. Let me read a couple things I did write. Is this the same? I think I'm not sure I saved the most recent piece of this. Oh dear, I don't think I did. That's funny. So I do want to say I'm interested in people's well-being, right? And I know that I lived and tried to teach others and encourage others to live according to what I thought the Bible was saying on a whole bunch of topics. And that was to my own harm and detriment, which then also played out on to others around me. So I care about what holding up these texts called the Christian Bible uncritically and trying to apply it into your lives. I care about what that looks like. I care about how that affects people. I care that there are passages in this sacred collection that lead to harm for people, and that there are people, I used to be one of them, who will find a way to make it okay and to make it a part of God's plan, a part of God's ways are higher than ours. Spin that whole stuff about suffering makes you more Christ-like, all that stuff, not the time and place to get into that, but I'm interested in thriving, in humans being able to thrive. I'm interested both for myself and for those around me who are seeking such and find that the way they've been taught to read the Bible and engage the Bible has severely limited their ability to thrive. So I went from having the Bible as the ultimate authority to not needing it to justify my beliefs and actions. And that is a major shift, and it took me many years to go from that place to this place. But when I stopped needing the Bible to be okay, when I stopped needing the Bible to justify my beliefs, to justify whatever, when I stopped needing this Bible, this collection of writings and texts to be that source for me, it allowed me to have a much more free engagement with it and a much more honest engagement. And it allowed me the space to say, wow, that's a really interesting idea, this whole thing about social justice that's here in these stories. As well as to say, yeah, and this theme about women as property to men that's there from beginning to end, that's an ancient way of thinking that I think we need to be able to let go of, or to acknowledge and then deconstruct and let go of, right? So I went from believing it all as being God's dictated word. And the day I first started to think about the implications of that belief, right, that God kind of dictated it, like channeling, like, wait a minute, I don't believe in that. So what are you going to do with that, right? To a bunch of texts that a whole bunch of people wrote, and they had a whole bunch of motivations, a whole gamut of motivations, I would say. And there you have it. Can you find something useful in it? Sometimes you can. That's great, right? So this is, I hope this helps. I hope this explains a little bit more where I'm coming from. So I don't use big T truth. I don't talk about, any of these things. And when it comes to talking about God, because that's a part of this conversation today, I talk about who is being described or depicted in the texts. When this conversation about an identity around God or belief in God, in my opinion, is much more complicated than simply, are you a believer or an atheist? And I say that meaning, I am really bummed that I didn't save my edits to this thing. Maybe it's somewhere else. Anyway, I say that meaning this. When people talk about whether you're an atheist, people ask me if I'm an atheist. And what I say is, what is the God that you are asking me about? Is it the one depicted in the Bible? If that is the only option for believing in God, I think we should all be atheists. End of story. The being described is very human-like. It's very petty. It's reactive. It isn't loving. It is threatening. It is. It doesn't, call us to our best selves over and over and over and over again. It does the opposite, right? It is very controlling. It's very human-like. And all of that I've described is to be expected if God is being described by humans. And if God is being described as a being that we relate to and interact with, and that interacts and moves and acts in the world and like controls things like a puppet master or whatever, like all of that is usually what people mean when they ask if I'm an atheist. Do I believe in that? And no, I don't. And please stop, right? But that description isn't the only one that's available to humans for this category or label of God. Now, when it comes to talking about the Bible, yeah, I'm an atheist. That is the most ridiculous thing to believe in that God, because that God is cruel and is abusive and controlling and all kinds of stuff, right? So, two different things there, but that's an important thing about my own biases, where I'm coming from. As a biblical scholar, I'm talking about what the biblical texts put into reality when they are upheld and applied, in particular when they're applied uncritically. Okay, so that was a long intro. Okay, I need a moment here. This is not the one I thought I was using. So, oh, maybe it is. Oh, that's even weirder. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I guess that is it. Okay, so sorry about that, folks. I was trying to be very organized and I just got a little bit distracted, apparently. Okay, so I also need to point out, sorry, this is going on, but it's helpful, right? Now I'm going to read some of the comments that I wrote. Having spent a decent amount of time in philosophy seminars and ethics classes, I am also in tune with processing whether a person's commitments, whether it's mine or those of others, line up with their words and actions. within the larger world, not just in their own life, right? I think this is a thing that we're allowed to do as humans, and it is important to do that respectfully, right? Or to be able to do it somewhat respectfully. This is an important piece, it seems to me, when we're talking about someone who's a leader in any way, shape, or form. Do the actions and their claims line up with their stated commitments? And this is important, particularly in light of what Gavin said at the opening of his video, okay? I'm going to back up because I did have the wrong document open. Let me read this, and then I have two more points I want to read, and then we'll move into my specific comments on the video. So when I was talking about there's a different way to think about God than just as a being in the heavenly realms that's very human and controlling and all that stuff, there are other ways to talk about God. And one of the most powerful is, and it's the best depiction I've seen of it. I'm going to engage this in a book in the future. But if you want to look at what I mean, what I'm hinting at there, trying to point to there, I would recommend you look at Octavia Butler's two books, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents. In that, she talks about God as change, period. And that, to me, makes sense. So I'm not going to get into that now. But that, just to let you know, I'm not just talking out of my butt when I say this over and over again, which I've said it a lot. But here's my last point, and then we're going to get into this. When I consider responding to or engaging content created by an apologist, I feel a need to offer this comment. I do not think that the Bible or God need to be defended. And that is at baseline what apologists do, right? If they cannot handle honest interrogations, then they do not deserve any devotion from people, in my opinion. An apologist, and I say this as a former one, enters into a space with the intention to defend. And you'll hear Gavin say that multiple times, right? As an educator, I make it my intention and purpose to better understand. This has made all the difference in the world for me and for my students over the years. So when we look, I'm shifting into the video now. So there are, I'm not kidding. I've mulled this over the last week. And ultimately, I'm going to point out lots of little things. And this isn't going to be a nitpicky thing. I get that Gavin has very good intentions. I really do. But there are lots of points I want to point out, like things I want to point out, but there are two overarching things going on here from my perspective. One is he never defines war rape. And so the whole intention of this passage within Deuteronomy is not being accurately engaged. And that, to me, then spills over into all these other issues, which is not understanding well what rape actually is, either in an ancient context or today, not understanding what marriage in the Bible actually is. And so for me, that was a big issue. Like, you're not being honest about what's going on here. He's talking about taking a woman and making her his own and doing it in all these ways. That's what we call marriage today. They don't have a word called marriage. They didn't have a verb to marry. Men just took women. That's what they did. That's biblical marriage, is taking women. So that means that biblical marriage in the Hebrew Bible is women don't get consent. Like, you can label that whatever you want to label that, but that was never addressed, right? So for me, that is a big deal. That a scholar is not able to just be honest about that. He's really trying to struggle and wrestle with and be honest about a bunch of other things about it. And I respect that and appreciate that. But that piece is very unsettling to me. The other then is related to what I said when I talked about his opening 3 points that he wants this video to address. I believe him. I believe he means that. I believe he means well. And I believe that he believes in the compassion of God and I believe that he does not affirm or condone abuse of women and children, right? These are things he brings up. But the problem there for me, so this is the second overall piece that keeps showing up in all these other ways, is that apparently he hasn't sat with the way the Bible encourages the abuse of women and children. in the way that it teaches people to think about men in charge, the way it teaches men to get to have domination over others, the way it teaches people to think about life as us versus them, this kind of general framework. The Christian Bible does a really good job of encouraging us versus them mindsets. And Gavin even points out a couple of really interesting examples that I think are actually problematic examples in our culture. Not things to say, see, we do this too. Some of the things he points out are actually negative symptoms of patriarchy. And it's like he doesn't realize that those things are connected. These ancient texts that endorse and perpetuate patriarchy are still having an effect in these ways that are about antagonism and needing to, it's us versus them, and right, this whole mindset that it just pervades this entire video, which means it probably pervades all the ways he talks about the Bible and God and faith, and I think he means well. But all of this is why I'm coming at it fundamentally differently. It's why I don't really enjoy engaging apologists, because we're doing two so dramatically different things. You have to do all of this conversation up front to say, this is what I'm doing and why I care. I'm going meta. I'm going big picture. What does this do to communities? How does this affect people? People internalize this stuff. When you tell women what to wear and you don't even mention a single word about what men need to wear, like all this, right? Dress code, like all of it is connected. Okay. So here we go. I'm not even looking at your comments yet because I'm trying to track with the points that I did have, and then I don't know. We'll just see how this goes. So this, I tried to be very organized. I'm not sure if it's gonna if I'm succeeded. Okay. Yep. Here we go. So I'm actually going to play his video at 1.5 speed. I don't mean to be disrespectful by that. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I want to play as much as I can of him to give him in context, his comments in context. And it was just easier to just go ahead and play it, and we'll skip the parts we don't need to look at. But I am going to just, for the most part, we're going to watch this together for the most part. Let me do this. So this is going to take a second to fix this. All right, let's see. How does that look? That's probably good. Okay.
Ancient Israelites commit war rape. This is a concern that's raised against the Bible. Those of us who are followers of Christ will probably hear this at some point. If you haven't heard this yet, you'll probably hear this at some point. This is one of the toughest passages in the Old Testament to try to defend. Deuteronomy 21, 10-14.
Trying to defend, not on the table here. I don't ever think it should be. And it's almost weird to me that people talk about it that way. Like, I understand why they do. I used to, but it's just, that's not where no, stop defending.
Read it and put it up on the screen in a moment. But first, just to explain this a little bit, this is a spin-off of a previous video I did on the conquest of Canaan, where I was trying to defend the book of Joshua.
Do I need to say it? Defend the book of Joshua? No, we need to critique the book of Joshua.
To these passages that are talking about the specific concern of sexual exploitation in the context of war, which is a little different from just violence in general. And I realize this is so difficult. We need a whole separate video on this, even though this video won't be as long as that one. And just to try to provide helpful resources for people on this, the purpose of my YouTube channel is to create gospel assurance through theological depth. So this totally fits with that. Try to
gospel assurance, when you're talking about the Hebrew Bible, is so very anti-Judaic. The gospel isn't in the Hebrew Bible.
Explain some of these tough passages. By the end of this video, I hope that you will be better equipped and better maybe have concerns alleviated if you're a follower of Christ, or if you're exploring Christianity. Maybe this is a stumbling block before you could become a Christian. You know, I hope this could remove stumbling blocks. And what I hope is that by the end of this video, you could see something, just a little bit of the compassion that is in the character of God that's ultimately revealed in the whole Bible, especially through the person of Jesus.
When you say that the compassion of God is revealed through the whole Bible, what that says to me as a biblical scholar is that you're not really paying attention. And I say that I feel like I'm just kind of unfiltered today. I'm trying to imagine that Gavin might. I don't think he's actually going to watch this, but I'm trying to imagine him in the audience, right? So with respect to your life experiences and the time you've spent caring for other people, and that I absolutely believe you care about people. But to say that God's, I mean, I am probably going to start crying today, right? To say that throughout the Bible, we see God's compassion tells me you're not paying attention to a lot of really important instances. We'll just leave it at that for now.
And my argument is that this passage, though it is not God's ideal, in its historical context, represented a protest against abuse. Now, let me say right out of the gate.
When do we know then when something in the Bible is an element of God's ideal? So this is the cherry picking thing that everybody does, but it's a fascinating thing, a way to defend this passage. This isn't an ideal. What's the litmus test for when something is an ideal? Right? Okay.
Here, we're going to talk about some brutal realities. If you're under the age of 18, or if the topic of sexual mistreatment or sexual violence is especially sensitive for you, I would recommend maybe don't watch this video. I'm not going to be graphic, or there will be no embellishments or anything, no pictures and nothing. But I am going to just try to factually explain some terrible things about human history that we have to know about the ancient world. So I hope that this video will help people.
He says it multiple times, so I'm just going to say it this one time, but he's going to say it several other times in this video where he talks about ancient history, the violence in the ancient world. And it really, to me, this is another layer of you're not paying attention, right? It's throughout human experiences and time. It's not just an ancient thing that, maybe popped up once in one of the wars that he's going to refer to in the 20th century. No, honey, come on. And it's painful. It's painful that you don't realize that you're trying to do that. And that's connected to other things about being an apologist. And I get that, but it's just like, please stop saying it's just an ancient thing. Okay. It is currently a problem. There are more women murdered by their partners, right, than there are people dying in war. That's not true. Not current wars. I used to have a thing I would show in my classroom, in my classes at the end of a semester, in like biblical intro. And it was like, it covered like 10 years of the war in Afghanistan or Iraq. Like, there were 4 times as many women killed by their partners than there were US soldiers who died in these battles. Like, this is what makes me angry. He doesn't know the extent to which this is happening for people right now.
Well, I hope that it will serve people, and I hope that it will help oppose the terrible practice of sexual violence and mistreatment of women and children. This is actually something that's a huge.
So the irony in that is that this passage is about how a man is allowed to sexually mistreat a woman.
Problem in the world today as well, especially through the influence of pornography, and just the way things are going is not.
All right, I wrote something about the pornography thing. I'm going to read my comment. When he said that pornography is a significant contributor to the abuse of women and children, every single one of us on the panel, our jaws dropped. What went through my mind, I cannot speak for my colleagues, is that pointing a finger at porn in that moment was a fairly large miss or redirect. In other words, there's a whole range of pornography, by the way, and there are. So I'm not even going to get into that can of worms, right? But if you want to talk about the problematic elements of it, the abuse of women, the controlling of their bodies, a form of pimping them out, all these things, then I'm going to point you back to passages in the Bible that do the same thing, and that over and over and over, this numbing of people's minds that biblical texts play out and cause, such that the people believe that men can do this to other people, and in particular to women. So it's like the biblical texts themselves are a part of this problem. And I had this other comment, right? So sexual violence in the context of war is connected intimately to intimate partner violence. Like any form of a man using his penis as a weapon, that's about power and control. That's not right. And so whether it's men raping the men they just conquered, which we have depictions of that as well, or whether it's men taking the women in town, all of that is about power and control and domination. That is what happens behind closed doors in way too many relationships, just in this country alone. Power, control, and domination. So it makes me nauseated that he doesn't get that connection. I believe he means well. I really do. I believe he does not want the abuse of women and children. And that is why it brings me to tears, that he doesn't get how this Bible is a part of that. Okay. I'm going to keep going now. We'll get through this, I promise.
I'm good right now. So I want to give my life to try to make the world a better place. Explaining some of these passages and talking about these tough issues is one way I try to do that. Even though I know this will not be convincing to those who are really just committed to the other side, but hope.
Committed to the other side, right? As if this is sides, not about life. And people want to be loving and kind and live life. The fact that as an apologist, and again, I'm tapping into my former days with that, he does see it that way. It's us against them instead of there might be something for all of us to learn from each other or whatever. Like there's so much there that needs to be protected and defended. And so for him to say people on the other side, I just want to walk out of the room. I don't want to engage people like that. I genuinely have had to cut people out of my life so I don't have to hear it so much. But and I get that he's doing what he thinks he needs to do. And I get all of where but it makes me sad that he would say that about me. I want to take these passages seriously.
Hopefully, if you're approaching this with an open mind, maybe this could help. All right, let me start by reading the passage. As I read it, you will understand why it's a difficult one. Many people call it the pretty woman text. Verse 10.
Excuse me, the pretty woman text? Did anyone else flash to the movie with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere? I did. Obviously, I didn't. That's why I said, did anyone else? The pretty woman text? Can we talk about that label? Who calls it that? Do you understand how you are just like distilling that this is about a man with desires for a beautiful woman? How is that a useful? Okay, I'm going to keep going.
When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother for a full month. And after that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her.
He doesn't talk about this because I imagine it's just not even at all on his radar, right? So I just need to point out that the Hebrew here doesn't say take her to be your wife. It says in verse 11, you desire her. So you're attracted to her. You want her and you desire to take her to be your woman. There's no wife language there. You bring her to your house. She shall shave her head, do all these things, right? All this stuff. After that, you may go into her and be her man, and she shall be your woman. The language in the Hebrew is not using marital language. That's our way of making sense of this relationship. I'm not in denial of that. But the part of the point here from my perspective, and in particular because I've just spent a great deal of time looking at what marriage actually is in the Bible, he's glossing over all of this, right? He's focused on the end of marriage, and he's not paying attention to what the language itself is doing. I'm not sure if now is the time to pause.
Ooh, tough passage. Just reading it, you can feel like, whoa, what do we do with this one, right? Here's my thesis. This is not a timeless ideal, but in its historical context, it was a protest against abuse. Now, let me explain that, what I mean by not a timeless ideal. I'm not criticizing the Bible or saying the Bible's bad. I'm just saying, let's read the Bible the way Jesus did. In Matthew 19.
Okay. Reading the Bible the way Jesus did is, yep, I'm going to come back to that. He hasn't at any point defined war rape. And so he talks about that in his, that's how he labels it. So I'm just going to read the Britannica.com's definition of a rape crime, or rape as a weapon of war. The rape of women by soldiers during wartime has occurred throughout history. Indeed, rape was long considered an unfortunate but inevitable accompaniment of war. The result of the prolonged sexual deprivation of troops and insufficient military discipline. I find that also to be a little bit limited in terms of the justification or explanation there. Its use as a weapon of war was gruesomely demonstrated during World War II, when both Allied and Axis armies committed rape as a means of terrorizing enemy civilian populations and demoralizing enemy troops. Two of the worst examples were the sexual enslavement of women in territories conquered by the Japanese army and the mass rape committed against German women by advancing Russian soldiers. I think we should bring it. I mean, this is actually an important article because it talks about lots of different things. It talks about Rwanda. It talks about it doesn't talk about comfort women, for instance, which is another like element of the way that the exploitation of women's bodies, right, plays out in war context. I mean, there are just so many examples of it. And I realized they had to just choose a few poignant examples, more recent, and that's fine. But the idea of the rape of people in the midst of military events, that's not what's being described here. So Deuteronomy 21 isn't talking about that. And the fact that this is talking about how a man can take a woman and make her his does not in any way, shape, or form mean one way or the other, right? Mean that they were or they weren't. Say anything about what was actually happening on the fields, right? Or happening immediately prior to and interacting with and all of that stuff. When he looks at other passages that talk about what men are not supposed to do, that there's not supposed to be you're not supposed to have wet dreams. Gosh, like you can control that. You're not supposed to have emissions at night. Like the fact that there are laws saying that has very little to do with what was actually happening. And if dudes were actually like setting themselves outside the camp, if they did, like, so I just want to be very clear that he's coming at this saying that this is a rejection of abuse when is not talking about the war crime that we mean when we talk about rape as a function and as a weapon of war. That's not what this passage is talking about. When you see a woman that you want, that's not rape. That's a different thing. Okay? So back to my point about men taking women and making them their own is coercive. There's an implied lack of consent there, and that is what marriages happen. That is how marriages happen. That is how they are described, like that. So marriages in general are non-consensual. Like I have a very hard time saying they're like putting those two together because it's so much. And I almost feel like it makes it impossible to talk about at all. But people have been commenting and they're like, wait a minute, doesn't that mean that like all marriages then in the Hebrew Bible were a form of rape? Well, sort of. And I just don't have time or energy to like actually but that is part of what I'm trying to get people to see in my book, Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? Right? in the Hebrew Bible, they might, every now and then, they seem to be game, or they are willing to go along with it, right? Not the same thing. But anyway, so many forms of it. So Deuteronomy 21 isn't actually addressing the issue of the crimes of war rape. It is not addressing that. Okay? I'm going to put the Britannica article in the comments. Okay, I'm going to keep going here.
8. Note the emboldened words here. This is something I've emphasized in other recent videos on slaves. Now, let me explain that, what I mean by not a timeless ideal. I'm not criticizing the Bible or saying the Bible's bad. I'm just saying, let's read the Bible the way Jesus did. In Matthew 19:8, note the emboldened words here. This is something I've emphasized in other recent videos on slavery and the conquest of Canaan, that Jesus basically says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed. So that word allowed is really important. This is a regulatory law. This is something that Moses is, according to the interpretation of Christ, allowing or permitting, and it has a specific occasion, namely because of your hardness of heart. And then Jesus says, and I'll put it back up, the other emboldened part, but from the beginning it was not so. So Jesus.
Okay. So there are all kinds of things that any of us mental gymnastics we can do to make sense of that verse. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed this. Let me just read the passage in question and see if you hear it the same way you hear Gavin talking about it. Okay. I was going to share it, but I don't want to. Anyway, suppose a man takes a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. Just sit with that for a minute. Don't keep moving. Just think about that for a moment. He takes a woman, something objectionable. So he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. She then leaves his house and goes off to become another man's woman. Then, suppose the second man dislikes her. Are you processing what's actually being said here? Writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. Or the second man who took her dies. Her first man, who sent her away, is not permitted to take her again to be his woman after she has been defiled. For that would be abhorrent to the Lord, and you shall not bring guilt on the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. Fascinating how we just brought woman, sex, and land all together, and defilement all together in that last little phrase or two of this passage. What's happening in this passage is men are making decisions, in light of each other about a woman's body. What the passage in here in Matthew 19, in verse 9, Jesus is upholding that same way of talking about marriage. Jesus is having this exchange with the Pharisees about which reason for divorce Jesus is okay with. And whatever judgment he's slinging here, right? Pretending that Jesus isn't actually a Jew also. From the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his woman, because even in the Greek, there's still not yet husband and wife. It's still just man and woman. Whoever divorces his woman, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. So Gavin said that we should read the Bible the way Jesus does. And what this depiction of Jesus reading his own scriptures tells us is that we have men talking to each other about what men can and cannot do with a woman. This woman has absolutely no voice in terms of being divorced or married, and she doesn't get to initiate a divorce. And what is stunning to me, this was one of the most striking things, was the research for this book, Marriage in the Bible, was this passage in Matthew 19 was the most upending thing, I think, for me of the whole book. What is actually being said here, what Jesus is actually being attributed with saying, is that he's endorsing a Hebrew Bible way of looking at marriage. A man takes a woman, has sex with her, she's now his. End of story. And so if he sends her away, Another man gets to have sex with her, whatever, do that thing. But from that first guy's perspective, she is now defiled to him. Why? Because another man put his penis in her. Like, can we just say it? It makes me really frustrated that people, well, it was startling to me to see it, right? To see it that way, to realize that Jesus is being an ass, right? He is. I think I said that on the panel, the Diablocritics panel. The problem is reading it the way, the way Jesus is reading it, and the way what Jesus is saying is part of the problem, right? He's making it about sex. He's making marriage, the primary thing about marriage is sex. Sex is what makes them married. No wonder so many people today have a hard time not caring about what kind of sex a same-sex couple is going to have, right? Because their texts teach them to focus in on it this way. But what is also striking is that the problem here, not verse 8, like he's getting into, but verse 9, the problem with divorce, according to Jesus, is not the pulling apart of families. It's not the dividing up of resources. It's not the dividing up of friends. It's not what are we going to do with the children. It's not how am I going to survive on my own? Can you make enough to support you and me, two separate households now, right? That's ridiculous, ridiculously challenging for people, right? I get that, right? Like, it's not that. The reason you can't divorce is because you're going to have sex with someone else. That's it. This is so patently and steeped through about women's bodies as property.
This is recognizing some laws in the Old Testament, Law of Moses, first 5 books of the Bible, they didn't reflect God's timeless ideal, and they were not for all people at all times. On the contrary, they were a concession to human sin, trying to regulate human sin and hardness of heart at that time. Okay, but it's not God.
So just so we're clear, human sin and hardness of heart, Deuteronomy 24 is just if a guy doesn't like her cooking, or if he doesn't like, if there's something about her that displeases him. I mean, I'm not like, it's not like I'm here to defend that, but I'm trying to say that he is also not being fair. I mean, it's just stunning. What? Hardness of heart. Like, yeah, I get it. We don't want to just casually divorce people. I'm pretty sure that that's a good thing, and that's helpful and protecting and all that stuff. But Gavin, did you read Deuteronomy 24 right before you did this stream? He probably didn't, because he has a lot on his plate and he's doing a lot of things, right? But
God's creation.
I'm gonna have to cut this short.
And so this is not relativism. This is just reading the Bible in context. It's reading the Bible in relation to creation. From the beginning, it wasn't.
Okay, see, I'm just going to read the comment that I wrote on that. When someone refers to creation ideal, which he's going to in just a second, I tend to want to pause. This line of thinking tends to depend heavily upon Genesis 1 and 2. And honestly, that's what I address in the first 2 chapters of my book, Marriage in the Bible, because I'm trying to talk about Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 2:24, which are 2 of the passages that people use to define biblical marriage. And they're not doing what most people think that they're doing. So when people talk about creation ideals, they're usually referring to those 2 stories. Right up until the humans take a bite of the forbidden fruit, right? And it tends to be reading scripture as if it's relaying historical developments. That is a very common belief or framework for apologists, right? We're reading this much more literally than literarily. So the belief that these things actually happened, there was actually a time of human existence prior to original sin. Things got really messed up all around when humans sinned and changed things for us ontologically. Those are all beliefs that are hidden within that label, creation ideal, right? So you have to be able to understand that that's what he's saying and doing. And I find it really helpful to be able to push back on that and for various reasons. But there are so many big pieces here of assumptions and presuppositions that I don't think the Bible upholds. And so we're putting so much on it to have to stand up for and defend heteronormative marriage, Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Like, what? So, yeah, okay. Okay.
it's not so. And then it's reading the Bible in relation to its unfolding development, looking at the teaching of Christ. And so Jesus is saying that, of course, about Deuteronomy 24 and divorce laws, but divorce is not the only institution that's affected by the hardness of heart. Okay, so it's legitimate to at least ask, could this be so in other cases as well? And I think clearly it is. Deuteronomy 21 is a passage we have to interpret in its historical context, and we have to see what it's pushing against. Okay, so in my video on the conquest of Canaan, I use this metaphor of imagine you're watching the first Star Wars movie, episode 4, and you get to the end when they blow up the Death Star, and all you watch is the missiles going in, the Death Star explodes. You're going to have one impression, versus if you watch that in the context of the whole movie, you have a completely different impression. If that's all you watch, you might say, why are they killing all these people? But if you watch it in the context of the whole movie, you might say, oh, good, the good guys are winning.
They're still killing a whole bunch of people. So the dramatic example here for me is that as long as the good guys are doing it, it's okay. That is what happens in Joshua. The good guys are doing it, so it's okay. The people they're killing don't worship our God, so they're bad. Us versus them. I'm getting a little lightheaded. I'm not exaggerating. That he used this example. It's just stunning.
You have completely different reactions based upon if you see it in context. If you see,
just so we're clear, I don't. Actually, there's a part of me that does, like, oh yeah, let's go get them. But as a moral, ethical, human, like humanitarian, like, they're still killing a whole bunch of people. We're still putting out stories that make us choose sides and believe that all those other people are evil because they're the enemy or on the other side. And so I am not at all surprised that an apologist, a Christian apologist who defends the Bible, doesn't see this, right? Because they don't see it in their own Bible. They found a way to make it okay in their own Bible. So of course they're not raising those same questions about really kind of big and important cultural touchstones for us today.
Deuteronomy 21, in its historical context, it's a similar thing. In the ancient world, and here's where it gets difficult, so just talk this through. The rape of women and girls on the losing side of a military conflict was not only the standard practice, it was the celebrated standard practice. So you have artistic celebrations of sexual violence and exploitation of foreign nations placed upon coins, put on monuments, in other forms of art and commemoration. This was not only practiced pretty much ubiquitously, it was celebrated. You know, just like today in a football game, when a player scores a touchdown, it seems like people do this more and more and more. Even if you get a tackle, you celebrate. But in a football game, if you score a touchdown, a lot of times you'll spike the football and then do like a victory dance. And that's kind of a culturally accepted way of sort of the climactic celebration of what just happened. Okay.
Do you see what I'm trying to point out here? That, like, that celebrating every single thing is such an antagonistic way of living, even, right? And the big, making a big deal that you just got to touch it. Well, you know what? That's the whole point of the game, is to get a touchdown. So good for you. Like, like, he's raising a really powerful cultural example that I think he should be critiquing, not just laughing about. And the reason I think we can critique it is because I can see it in these, I look and see what's happened. I see it in these texts and they teach me to think that way. And so I've had to separate us versus them, celebrating the other's demise, right? Or, your victory over them. So I'm going to stop sharing this because I have a slideshow I want to share. I'm thrilled that you all are sticking with me through this because I'm just kind of all over the place. I do have a slideshow I want to share. And when he referred to this depiction, the celebration in coinage and all this kind of art, I agree with him. And the thing is, he's missing a layer of the problem, or a layer of the misogyny or sexism. Okay. But like I said, it's not just women that this is being done to. Okay. Again, and the fact that he seems to want to make it be only women makes me wonder about how I should not say that. I'm not going to finish. Nope, I'm not going to finish that. So I'm wondering, because I know he's been to Greece, I'm wondering if he's seen some of these places and some of these statues and some of these things. So I thought I would share with you one of my favorite places when I do a Footsteps of Paul trip, a very feminist Footsteps of Paul trip. There are 4 towns I love to go to: Ephesus, Pergamum, obviously Istanbul, and then Aphrodisias. Aphrodisias is one of my favorites. And so these are all images from Aphrodisia or Aphrodisias. Aphrodisias or Aphrodisia? Sorry, I'm not sure. But this is just a general picture of the town. I won't spend too much time on this, but I think images are really helpful. And I wonder if I should just get out of here so it's bigger. Let's do that for a little bit. So what I think it would actually, what I would like to add to what he has said about, sure, it's problematic that people are celebrating and putting it in a visual format, right? This conquering of other people. But what's happening here is groups of people are being personified as a female. Okay. So that's a different thing than just, in air quotes, oh, you can't see me. You can't see me. Oh, wait. Can you all hear me, by the way? You can hear me even if I'm not, is that right? Even if I'm not being seen, you can still hear me? I'm going to wait. Yes, thanks, Kip. So this says Crete. So Crete, this is the island of Crete is being represented by a female. Okay. So let me just briefly explain. I forgot to put the picture of it up. What we're seeing here, in Aphrodisia is there's an entrance to town that it's 3 layers. It's magnificent. And on the bottom layer, you have all these statues or whatever. And then the second layer is representations of all the people groups that the empire is conquered. And then on the top layer is all this depiction of royalty and all the, imperial people and, gods and goddesses that help them win and all that stuff. So you have the peoples that have been conquered. That's what we're looking at here. There'll be a statue or some representation of the people, and then they're standing on a form of a pedestal with the name of the people group. Okay. So I'll show you some of these in just a second. It's just pedestal after pedestal with a person representing the group. Why is it a female that represents a group of people that an empire has conquered? This is absolutely connected to what I was trying to point out about biblical texts and how it is still happening today. The idea of men dominating, having control over, conquering. It's this language we see in the Hebrew Bible that connects women to land. And those are both things that men get to conquer and enter into and take over, right? So Crete, so here's a map. I'll give you a second to kind of adjust. You're, seeing what's going on here. So the red, these are labels of the people in these various regions. And these are all the peoples that are represented in this visual, in this like 3D propaganda, right? Which is what that is. Sorry. Wonder if I can find a picture of that. And so you can see these are all the labels of the statues and the pedestals that are represented in this one particular room in the museum right there in Aphrodisia. So for instance, this is Besson over here, and it says Ethnus Besson, right? So the people of Besson. All right, look at this. So they have just a 5 here and 1 here, and I've written them in backwards. So Sikalia is down here at the bottom. Andizatone, Ethnus Andizatone, Ethnus Didanon, Ethnus Trun Pelon, Ethnus Raiton. This is Besson. Apparently, I forgot to look at this one up close. But let me just go back very quickly. So you can see all these names: Sicalia, Dardanon, Anditzone. You can find them all on this map, right? And by the way, the city that this is in is on the western coast of Asia Minor or Anatolia in this map. Aphrodisias is on that coastal place, right? So you're representing other parts of the empire that have been conquered by the emperor, and the emperor lives over in Italy, over in the Italian peninsula, right? So think about the element of propaganda here. Think about the projection of power and control and dominance that this is, right? But notice that all of these people are figured as female. This one is Armenia, right? The statue. It's a very moving in a very negative way statue here. When you look at it from the right hand side of the statue, you can see the guy's thigh behind her, and it just feels just so very both military and rapey, like he's got her by anyway. So I'm just going to keep moving, right? So, but people groups are being represented with a female, right? So this is the pedestal for this one, for the Tiberius over Britannia. And it says, the pedestal says Tiberius Clydios, right? Caesar. And then on the right, it says Britannia. So here is an example of, Tiberius being depicted with this flowing robe behind him, which is a deifying kind of a thing. And Britannia is a female. The people of Britannia are being represented with a female. This goes way beyond just men are raping women. This is on an empire-wide way of presenting the power and dominance over other people groups is to call them women. And I included a few of these just so you could see it. Their depiction. So this is the description that scholars in Turkey have come up with. The emperor is a naked warrior and is crowned by a personification of the Roman people wearing a toga. Let's go back and look at that. Crowned. So we can't see all of it because some of it's been destroyed. The stately civilian dress of Roman citizens. The crown is an oak wreath. Oh, this is for the next one. I'm sorry. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. So this is for the one we're about to look at. My bad. The crown is an oak wreath. And the corona civica, or civic crown, awarded for saving citizens' lives. The emperor is setting up a battlefield trophy, which I'll point out. Well, yeah. Beneath which kneels an anguished barbarian woman captive, which, again, is she just a woman captive, or does she represent the people, right? So you can see in the middle the naked emperor, and then the person on the right is the representation of Rome, right? Kind of blessing him or whatever, putting your hand on. And then the upper left-hand corner, that's what they mean when they talk about setting up a battlefield trophy. So that's what that is, like this kind of like torso of a soldier is that you see that over and over. And so the woman kneeling beneath him, right, is that a female captive, or is that a representation of the people they just conquered? A draped goddess strides forward to inscribe a military trophy. So you see how that's kind of the torso, whatever, is the military trophy. So is that an actual body, part of her body from the battlefield? I don't know, and I don't really care, but I just thought I'd say that. To which is bound a kneeling female captive. Again, is this actually a female, or does she represent more? The goddess, the irony here, right? The goddess is probably a personification, such as honor, virtue, or courage. Like dripping with irony, right? Okay, well, this is when people get into these conversations about just war and all that stuff, and this isn't the time or place for that, but I just need to point it out, right? Okay, we're gonna remove that, and we're gonna go back to sharing the video. A few more minutes of the video, and then I think I'll probably need to wrap this up.
So tragically, disgustingly, in the ancient world, artistic commemoration of war rape scenes was a climactic way of celebrating the victory. This is just what people did. And so you can find lots of examples of this where, it'll be soldiers pulling women by the hair, carrying them sideways in their arm. Sometimes the women will be only half clothed. And the clear implication of this art is overpowering and rape and violence against them. And it was a way of commemorating the victory. Okay, so just let that sink in for a second. This not only happened, it was celebrated. It wasn't something that was shameful. You see, in the world today, you can have terrible genocidal rape that happens. For example, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, the First and Second Congo War. You can have, I mean, so at points there were, the conservative estimates are that there's more than 1,000 rapes every day. Okay, it's really bad. The assaults on women were so horrible that the Human Rights Watch described it as a war within the war. Okay, it's like a whole separate component of war, this terrible treatment of women. I want to stop in the middle and just say, I hope everything I say in this video reflects care and honor for the dignity of women and for the importance of being an advocate for their protection and all vulnerable parties, because you get into human history and you see what people are capable of, and it's terrible.
I believe him that he means that. And that is part of what is so tragic to me about it all, right? I believe that he really does mean that. Woo! What just happened?
But so anyway, so in like the First and Second Congo War, there's genocidal rape happening. That was like the policy of all the different sides. That's happening. That happens in the modern world, but in the modern world, it's not put on art. You know, it's like people tend to hide that or feel embarrassed.
So are we clear about what's happening, right? Do people feel embarrassed by it? Do they just not want to talk about it? Was it a function of, I just keep going back to the word propaganda, right? And sure, there's an element of we've come a long way, baby, in not wanting to talk about the abuse of prisoners and talking about all these terrible things that people do, right? So that I agree with him on a certain level here, right? People aren't bragging about it, but at the, you know, I just feel like there's an element of the sexism here that he's missing, and I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
On this side of like the Geneva Conventions after World War II, where we have these sort of assumed standards of what does humanitarian treatment look like of civilians, for example, in a war context, we fall short of certain standards, but at least most people know what those standards are. In the ancient world, you didn't have the standards. Sexual violence was celebrated, and people were proud. You know, it was a way of saying, look what we were able to do to your women. And that was a way of sort of celebrating the war. In Deborah's song in Judges 5, you find this reference to the rape of Israelite women and girls by the Canaanites, and it's described as just, you know, this is just part of enjoying the spoils of military victory. And in the phrase, a womb or two for every man, we could translate that even more crudely, though I won't do that right here. But I'm just trying, unfortunately, we have to kind of let the hammer fall, of be a little bit shattered by the brutality of this, and grieve it in order just to take it in and understand how dark human history is, unfortunately. And that's the ancient world. That's how bad it was.
Just, again, not just the ancient world.
It was, but not even just that bad. It's worse, because rape in those circumstances was often conjoined with the most grotesque forms of violence against these poor people who would be defeated. And so I won't even go into that. I've already in my last video talked about one of the books that has a whole chapter on torture during ancient warfare. Let's not go there. Just use your imagination and let's not describe it. Hopefully you get the point already. Okay, so here's how one text puts this. Speaking of Deuteronomy 21, and I've drawn a lot from this book for this video, quote, if we are to understand these biblical texts, we need to be reading ancient war documents from Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and so on. Once people do this, they discover that the ancient treatment of women in war was utterly horrendous. It often included bodily mutilation of women, cutting off their breasts and displaying them on poles, torturous deaths, multiple rapes, and a type of concubine enslavement where women would be required to perform perpetual sexual favors and or produce offspring for their owners.
Just so we're clear, that is precisely what Deuteronomy 21 is outlining how to do politely. Okay? You're taking a woman that you found, you thought she was beautiful, you're going to take her home and let her do her thing, like have the time of mourning and do all these assimilation things, which is deeply problematic, so that you can have sex with her and that she will give you children. Like,
in ancient siege warfare, the fate of female captives was considered so dreadful. If it looked like a city was about to fall, men at times killed their own wives.
Like, this is also happening today. Like, just so we're clear, like when I first heard this, the thing that popped in my head was, you know, the depiction of women, enslaved women on this continent, sometimes killing their children because they didn't want the life of an enslaved person for their child, right? Just read some history, you know.
Ugly, utterly ugly world. The treatment of humanity by humanity is sometimes staggering. In our present day context, this ancient war portrait shares some commonality with the rape camps of Rwanda. Placing the biblical text within that sort of war context of the ancient world allows us to see Deuteronomy 21, 10-14 in a different light. All right. I put that quote in my notes, and I didn't, maybe it's for the good. I'm just going to leave it up. Maybe it's for the good that I didn't edit out the garish parts of that. I can reassure you, no more physical descriptions. I know some of us find it hard to take in. There are times in my study of this, it is kind of nauseating. But we need to know what happened. So maybe it's good that I left that in, but we'll just move forward now. But the point is this: Israelite war practices can only fairly be appraised in that historical context, rather than comparing them to, you know, after World War II is over and the modern world and so forth. In that context, the ancient Israelite practices were different. There's no glory.
So I'll say it again in case you didn't catch the first 30 minutes. This isn't about what's happening in the battlefield in the war context. It's about finding a way to make what you want, which is to take this woman for yourself. We're not talking about the crimes of war. These texts are not talking about the crimes of war. That's not what it's talking about. The act of raping another person is qualitatively different, even though it's still somewhat problematic, than what is being described here in Deuteronomy 21. It is still forcing a woman to do some things that she has no choice over. So that still makes it a form of this word I've said way too many times today. Okay.
Glorification of sexual violence. On the contrary, there are these restrictions that are designed to curb away from those kinds of abuses. There's absolutely no battlefield rape, for example, that which was extremely common in the ancient world. Now, some scholars dispute that, and they say, well, Deuteronomy forbids rape after the battle is over, but doesn't say anything about rape during the battle, so the Israelite soldiers were free to do that.
And I just want to be clear, right? Where does it forbid rape after the battle? If he means this passage, if he means Deuteronomy 21, then that is to me a rather disingenuous reading of Deuteronomy 21. Right? It's because do you not understand what's happening for the woman in Deuteronomy 21?
And this is one of those readings that's just overly cynical and just wrong. That's not a good way to read the Bible. It's an argument from silence, and it runs contrary to the entire tenor of the Old Testament. Okay, this wouldn't make any sense to have this strict 30-day waiting period after the battle is over if the Israelite men had been free to pillage and rape and so forth during the war. No, during Israelite warfare, the Ark of the Covenant, an object of extreme holiness that mediated God's presence, would be taken from the temple onto the battlefield.
As he does this thing about talking about the sacredness of the battle. Again, my stomach does a flip or two. I don't know about you all. And I'm mindful that this is a thing to critique. Instead of to be okay with. You're taking your God literally front and center into battle. This is a holy war. What context do we hear those two words put together in today? People want to critique and judge when people who look different from them do that today, but you're finding a way to be okay with this passage and the fact that all these battles in Joshua, they are bringing the presence of their God with them. So that makes it okay? Justifies the battle, or it makes the battle sacred in some way? I mean, I'm starting to want to say some curse words here. You know what I'm saying?
Carried by the priests. The understanding is the Lord is going with us into battle. And believe it or not, battle was considered an act of worship, a holy act unto the Lord. And from that point, the Israelite men are in a...
So it does sound like he's not happy with that. He's not pleased with that. But he's still talking about it like it's a sacred thing. Right? So when is it a thing for all time and when is it not? Or I get that he's saying, believe it or not, it was seen as a sacred thing. And so he's actually questioning that, which is, I want to highlight that, right?
Sacral state. Okay. So for example, they could eat the consecrated bread normally given only to the priests, and they were forbidden from any kind of sexual activity. Any kind of sexual activity would require a kind of ritual cleansing, as you can see in Deuteronomy 23, for example, and the Israelites command. And then after the battle, for other nations, a lot of times what would happen is female prisoners of war would be made into temple slaves, where
let me let him finish his point here.
Fortunately, sexual exploitation would be an ongoing feature of their life. And this is true both in ancient Mesopotamian contexts and in the ancient Egyptian sources. We see this. So like in the ancient Mesopotamian context, you have the goddess Ishtar, who's the goddess of war and sex. And basically, a lot of prisoners of war are made into temple prostitutes to fund the temple. And I won't go into that here. In terms of, I don't want to be too lurid in this, but I'm trying to convey these horrific truths enough that you get the picture, but not go too far, which is a tricky thing. In ancient Egypt, you have these so-called houses of women, where basically women, prisoners of war, were brought, and the essential purpose is a kind of industrial production of slave children. So they're just basically there to produce as many offspring as possible to become slaves. Okay, so you got that kind of stuff going on in the ancient world. All of that is strictly prohibited in Israel. There's absolutely no temple prostitution. There's no
Genesis 38 might beg to differ.
Ritual sex in the temple as there was in the pagan world. Sex and worship are completely separated, just as battle and sex are completely separated. The alternative for the Israelites is Deuteronomy 21. Okay, and again, you start to see when you're looking at that context, and then you're looking at this passage, you're starting to see, oh, That's the kind of stuff it's prohibiting and saying you can't do. And it's more fair to judge it in its context than like in the modern world. The first and most obvious difference here is the requirement of marriage in verse 3. Okay, that's the first coming out of our context. Someone might say, "Oh, how terrible that you're just being forced to marry or something like that."
So I'm going to skip some of this because I've already made my point about marriage in the Bible and how I don't think that we should be using words like husband and wife in the entire Hebrew Bible. In fact, in the entire Christian Bible, I don't think we should use the words husband and wife because that is misleading for us today. And it's a part of why, anyway, it's a part of the bigger picture here and the bigger problem that the language is much more raw and it's a very different kind of a relationship than what we tend to think of marriage being today, right? I'm not anti-marriage across the board, right? So I don't really want to deal with any of this. I'm going to skip over to. I might actually just be done. There are other things I could say, but I feel like, oh nope, we need to get over to. I didn't put the timestamp. Okay, let's see. 30 days of mourning. I like that. I don't disagree with the fact that he's trying to highlight that the 30 days to let a person mourn, leaving their people, it could be more generous. But the point remains, from my perspective, that she.
I'm not really going to get into that here. Okay, let's start.
That she is still being forced away from her people. She is being forced to be his woman. So I just don't have time for that. But so what I want to get over to is at the hair, nails, and clothing and all that stuff as a form of assimilation. It's a forced assimilation. Again, this is problematic. This is what colonization does. This is what, like, however you want to look at that. She's being forced to become an Israelite person. I think I said this before, but I'm going to say it again here. I have a question when I do Hebrew Bible intros. I do 4 a year. I ask students to look for what do Hebrew Bible passages say about tolerance of other faiths. And I have particular things that I highlight for them, like, hey, remember that question? Here's content that relates to that. And I will consistently have very well-meaning Christians make references in the final when they get to talk about what they learned. They will refer to Ruth, that the Hebrew Bible is tolerant of other faiths because look at Ruth. She was a Moabite and we embraced her. I'm like, yeah, but you embraced her because she came to worship your God, and as well, along with other things, so I don't want to deal with that stuff right now. What I do want to do is to talk about John, his take on John. I don't want to talk about the divorce stipulations because it's not helpful. Okay. His take on the compassion of God. I wish that what he's saying about that was more true. Was more.
Yes, this is a tough passage. It does not reflect the timeless ideal. This is not what everybody should do in every place, as Jesus teaches us in Matthew 19. But can you see what it's pushing against in its historical context? Can you see what it's trying to do? Trying to say, no, don't do what all these other nations are doing. You can't treat women in these barbaric ways. You have to wait.
It is still treating women in barbaric ways, just to be clear.
Marry her. She becomes a full member of the community. She's never going to be a slave. And that last little phrase, for you have humiliated her.
He's going to talk about the compassion of God, and that is not what the text is talking about. It's not talking about humiliating her. It's about defiling her. It's about, it's not about her. It's about the men. Okay. And whether or not you can feel something
of the character of God in that, because as you look at Deuteronomy 21, then you step back and you look at it in light of what it would be like to I do not condemn person. But of course, Jesus draws attention away from her. And I preached on this passage. See it all in context. What you have is a story about a God who shows remarkable compassion for the vulnerable. All throughout the scripture, God is always choosing the outcast. It's always the people in this world that are discarded. And the world says, oh, you're no good. You'll never amount to anything. You're not important. And the world just tosses that person aside.
Is that what the world does? Or is that what not well-reared children who become adults do? It makes me a little cranky when people start to make these faithful people are kind and the worldly people are not. It makes me very cranky because I don't think that that's about the way the world works. I see a lot of kindness in the world. I see a lot of people who are willing to stand up for the humanity of others, who were trying to counter the dismissal of humans just because they're different or somehow deemed inferior. And that is a symptom of patriarchy. So don't give me that the world works that way. No, that's just people who weren't raised well that do that.
The person God is drawn to. God cares about the vulnerable. I think of this with Christ.
Does God care about the vulnerable? Because there's too many places in the Bible where God absolutely mocks the vulnerable and uses a woman as a way to shame men. Like, let's be consistent. You care, Gavin, about the mistreatment of women and children. I know you do. So take a closer look at your scriptures. Take a closer look at John 8. Let's look at your take on this story.
Also a context in which women were very mistreated. And for some reason, I'll finish with this, the story of John 7:53 to 8:11, even though there's textual concerns about that story, I think it's consistent with the character of Christ reflected in the Gospels. It came to my mind, and this is where the woman is caught in adultery. She's brought forward. Of course, the man isn't. There you see again the tendency of human sin.
The tendency of human sin, or the tendency of male egos? Because that's not about a woman in any way, shape, or form. That's about men. It's about men and their egos, right? It's about, right? Like, don't make that just human sin.
To target and single out the vulnerable person. But of course, Jesus draws attention away from her. And I preached on this passage. I have a lot to say that I love about this passage, but I'll just put my finger on these simple words of when he says, I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more. Can you imagine? I mean, just let this strike your heart. Can you imagine what it would be like to look into the eyes of God incarnate and hear him say to you, I don't condemn you? Can you feel?
What would be lovely is if he had said, I am so sorry they just brought you out here, a single female in front of the synagogue full, or temple full of men, you, one single female, brought up here and used to try to trap me. I'm so sorry they used you like that. I'm so sorry that you have to put up with this shit. I'm so sorry about any of this, that they're trying to judge you. There is so much about this story that is not okay with me. Neither do I condemn you. How do you catch someone in adultery? Right. Of course, he points out, yes, you should bring both people. I appreciate that, Gavin. Both should be brought up, but they weren't. And that is a piece to apologize to her for, if this is even an issue. Bringing people, this form of judgment at all. How do you catch a woman? How do you catch that person? What is the circumstance out of which you can do that reliably? Is she a sex worker? Is she someone who, there's just so many possibilities. And when you say, neither do I condemn you, go from now on, sin no more, that always, that just makes me want to flip him off. Which part of this was a sin? How do you know what actually went down? How do you know what actually happened? How do you know that she's not just trying to support herself financially? Is that actually a sin? There are so many pieces to this. And I know that Gavin means well, and I know that he really believes in it, because I can remember thinking this way. But there is so much to this scenario, this story itself, that may have been an incremental step towards more compassion, but it's still lacking dramatically. And we're still not, so we're still stuck in the first century element of compassion instead of a 21st century, which should be leaps and bounds beyond that. Right? I'm just going to be done. Just done here. We're good. I have not tracked with any of your comments. I just stayed on the other page so that I could pause and do all the things. So that's most of what I wanted to say. Thanks for being here. I can see that you all have been chatting amongst yourselves, which makes me really happy. Are there any questions that you'd like me to answer? I'm not going to go back through right now because I am winding down. Thank you, Kip. I appreciate that. Maybe she was having sex with her first husband. Exactly. Her first man. Let's call him man and not her first husband. Her first man. Yep. I did all your adequate jokes. That's awesome. Maybe I will. Should I go back? There's a lot of comments, so maybe I'll go back through later if I need a little distraction. I know he means well. I know. I absolutely know that. I really do. And that's why it's so sad to me that he doesn't see the problems in this text that he is devoting his life to protecting and defending. Thank you so much, you all, for being here. I'm going to go do something relaxing. Thank you all for such kind support, for being here. Thanks, Pragmatic Crystal. I'm just going to say it now before I wrap things up. It is so lovely that you're here live if you wanted to be and were able to be. Thank you for that. And it is really fun to look up and see people I'm beginning to be familiar with. It's also really lovely if you're watching this later. Thank you for when you like a video or when you even just do a quick comment on a video. It helps other people who are like-minded with you to find my work. So please subscribe if you haven't yet, or tell a friend about a video. All of those pieces help me and help you actually find more people out there who are like-minded to you. I appreciate the people who support me financially. I appreciate the people who support me in all kinds of ways. I'm working on the audio for my book, Marriage in the Bible, which might be a much more accessible way for people to be, to hear it, to learn from what I'm trying to present there. So I'm excited to get that out soon. And what else can I say? I just thank you. Thanks everyone for your support and for sharing the love with others. I appreciate it. I'm gonna go out with a little this. So thanks. I'll be back next week. It'll be just me. It'll be a couple more weeks before I bring on a scholar. So I'll see you all next week for another story time.